Hello, everyone. My name is Graham Salinger. I graduated from Arcadia University's International Peace and Conflict Resolution program in 2017, and since then have been working as a restorative justice practitioner, a mediator, and a conflict coach. I started off with Good Shepherd Mediation Program located in downtown Philadelphia, and have since been working for the Center for Community Justice in Elkhart, Indiana. And I also have my own consulting company called Salinger Coaching Solutions. I work with business managers, leaders, and their teams using my conflict resolution expertise to help them really power through obstacles that are getting in the way of performance, progress, and growth. And I'm here today to talk to you about peace building during the pandemic. Just for context, the type of work that I currently do um, is I do family law mediation. I do mediation called VORP, which is Victim Offender Reconciliation Program, where I meet with victims and offenders that committed crimes against the victims and have mediations with them. I also do school-based mediation and restorative justice work with schools and organizations to help them deal with harm. So I say all that so that there's a broad understanding of when I say peace building, what type of peace it is that I'm building with whom I work. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is how COVID-19, this pandemic that's been going on for about a year at this point, has fundamentally changed and shift conflict in terms of where it happens and therefore who we are in conflict with. It has changed some dynamics in terms of the types of conflict. I'm also going to talk about the impact of stress, both in creating conflict and making it harder to reduce the harm that is caused by conflict. And then I'm going to talk about the implications of all those things for peace building practitioners. So the first thing is where conflict happens and who conflict is happening with, right? So if we think about conflict, we know that conflict tends to happen with people that you're in proximity with, right? It's if you're a kid, it's happening with people that you're at school with. If you're an adult, it's happening with people at work, right? Our conflict space is fundamentally part of who we spend time with and where we're spending time. And COVID, with everyone being home for the amount of time that they're home compared relative to where they would have been at work or at school or in other spaces, means that we're and sometimes we're in small spaces, right, in terms of our apartments or whatever, right? So it means that we're going to be in conflict with different people, right? So where you may have been in conflict at school and now you're in conflict maybe at home, you're with your parents more, right? Or if you had work-based conflict, um, that might be the same now, and I'll talk a little bit about how COVID has made working more difficult as well. But now you're also juggling the fact that you're working while you're at home, and there might be some conflict with your spouse or your roommate because you're shifting from being at work to being at home. And so just fundamentally, our spaces have changed as a result of COVID, and therefore where conflict happens and who we're in conflict with has changed as well because we're in a different space. Types of conflict. Generally speaking, conflict is about needs. And our needs as humans are physical needs, we have safety needs, we have security needs, we have psychological needs, and we have social needs. And all of these things are being challenged by the pandemic, right? We know, for example, when the pandemic first started, right, things like food and were there was some scarcity, right, when we went to the stores, and so those needs weren't being met, right? If you're work is a very social interaction, school is a very social interaction, and now all of a sudden we're at home and that need is not we're home at home 24/7, right, and that need is not being met in the same way, right? Safety and physical needs, right? If we go into a store and we see somebody not wearing a mask, that might react very differently to how he would have reacted to just seeing somebody without a mask a year ago, right? And so conflict is about needs, and COVID-19 has really attacked the basic needs that we have, which therefore contribute to an escalation and change in the types of conflicts that we have, right? So at work, we might have scheduling conflicts, right? And that might create also balancing for those of us who have kids, right? Balancing work with also having to parent and e-learn and be the teacher, right? Also, just work-life balance is fundamentally different because our space at home and our workspace might be the same. So we might have scheduling conflicts that interfere with our need for our own time and the needs and balancing the needs of others that we're spending our time with, right? There might be less communication at work. There might be less oversight because we're at home, we're working a little bit more. We may be working a little bit more autonomously than we were before when we had direct reports and managers and things like that. We're going to have to rely a lot more on trust because people are working from home again and there's not as much direct perhaps oversight. So if you were at a workspace where maybe there was a lack of trust before, that can create additional levels of conflict now because people are expected to be working a little bit more independently, right? And if you don't come from a work culture where the expectation or there was already a cultural norm or value of folks working autonomously, that might create some cultural change within your workforce that creates conflict. That could also be a positive thing, being forced to trust your staff or trust your or your manager or your leader might, this challenge of COVID might be forcing people to create new levels of trust that weren't there before. So it kind of falls in both realms. It can be both a challenge in terms of you already had trust issues, but also an opportunity, right? In terms of now it's forcing you to build that trust. Other needs, right, that this conflict is really creating, obviously it's financial needs. If you've been hit by COVID, if somebody in your family or a loved one has unfortunately gotten COVID, that's going to create a whole new ball game of financial needs, right? And also all of a sudden we're being forced to make health decisions that we may not, or previously were not able, not required to make. So there's just the very real fact that COVID is both a financial and health crisis potentially. And so that's going to create new types of conflict within the family. I know, for example, there have been mediations that have been going on and in conflict between families because one parent wants the kid to go to school and the other parent wants the kid to stay at home. And so that's really fundamentally, that's not necessarily an education decision, but it's a health decision. And that can create conflict within families. As I said, I do divorce and custody mediation. This is very much complicating divorce and custody mediation, just because when there is divorce and custody, there are a lot of logistics to consider. One of which is when there's drop-off points between custodial parents. Oftentimes you drop your kid off at a public place. Well, that is becoming harder to do now because of stores being closed or one parent not wanting to drop their kid off at a public place because of health concerns. So there are little things depending on the type of work that you do that can also be complicated. But the emphasis there is that this pandemic is really challenging our needs, our fundamental needs that all humans have, and that conflict is about needs. When you're in conflict, it's about needs. As a practitioner, that means my job is always to think about needs and how needs are not being met and try to create creative spaces for people to figure out those needs. And so COVID is just exacerbating or contributing to needs-based conflict. And I'm going to shift to a little bit of a conversation about stress and the impact of stress on conflict. When we're not getting our needs met, that creates stress, right? If we are having financial challenges, that's going to create stress on ourselves. That's going to create stress perhaps on our marriage, our family dynamics, right? If we are not getting our health needs met, that's going to create stress as well, both physical stress and psychological stress. If we're worried about, not even if we've experienced or gotten COVID, but just sort of the fear, the potential for these things to happen creates stress. And so stress impacts conflict in sort of two fundamental ways. One is that it can heighten conflict. If you are normally in stress, if you are normally stressed out, you might get into an argument with somebody, right? You might get into an argument at work because there's a very strict deadline and you're under a lot of stress and a lot of pressure to get that, right? Normally, though, if we're in stress, if we're experiencing stress, we have the capacity to, once that stress is over, deal with it, um, and move on. However, because of the sort of chronic stress that COVID is having, and the fact that it's creating stress from multiple angles and in multiple spaces, that means that our stress response is heightened. And it means it's also a slower recovery from being stressed. So while we normally might be able to deal with the fallout of the stress or the actual stress that's happening in a timely manner, because we're under constant stress, and even levels of trauma, individual and collective trauma, that means that we may be getting into more conflict because we're always at that point of stress. And we're not recovering as quickly as we normally would, right? So we are maybe constantly in a fight or flight mode, right? We might be getting more aggressive than we normally do because we're under chronic stress, right? Or we might be avoiding certain people or responsibilities or obligations because we're under stress and we just don't want to deal with those things. All right. We might be experiencing burnout at work, a lack of creativity. Basically, stress, chronic stress, fatigue, and trauma means that we're not bringing our best selves to our spaces. And if we're not bringing our best selves to our spaces, that basically means that we're also not working well with others in our best way, right? We're not working best with others. And so that means that that's going to heighten the possibility that we're going to be getting into conflict, right? Because we're stressed out, we're fatigued, there's just tension, and we may take that tension out on the wrong people. We might just be having a bad day. If we're not bringing our best selves, that means that we are not working in the way that in our maximum capacity. Now, normally, a factor that helps us deal with stress is community, relationships, really strong relationships. Have a strong psychological effect on helping us overcome stress. However, because of COVID, our sense of community, which normally would be helpful to us, is really broken, right? It's usually what's called a protective factor. But in this case, because we're stuck at home, we don't have the same social bonds, we don't have the same relationships as we would normally have. Not only are we stressed out, we don't have our community to go back to help us sort of de-stress and deal with that. So the first impact that stress has is that, as I said, it creates a heightened sense of conflict because of this stress that we have, which may manifest as fear or anger, right? And so that means we're heightened sense of stress, and stress state means we might get into conflict more easily and not be able to come out of it. And it also, because of this lack of community, because of the pandemic and our inability to sort of socialize in the same way, means that protective factor is missing. Now, that is the impact of stress on creating or leading to conflict. There's also the challenge that stress has for our ability to deal with conflict. So not only does it mean we're more likely to get in conflict, it also means that it challenges our ability to solve conflict in ways that we normally would. If you think about it this way, the things that are really needed to resolve conflict are creative thinking, the ability to think rationally, the ability to separate emotions from people, right? We might be upset about a situation, but that doesn't mean we have to be extremely upset at that person. Our ability to think rationally, right? And our ability to sort of problem solve, right? And that creates a certain level of creativity as well, right? But if we're experiencing stress, chronic stress or trauma, right, we are not thinking creatively. It actually blocks our ability to think creatively in the way that we would normally. And if we're not thinking creatively, that means that we're not going to be able to problem solve in the same way. It means we're not going to be able to deal with conflict or small problems also in ways that we normally would. And therefore, those things that we normally would be able to sort of deal with and think through, we're not able to do it in the same way. And so that means that when our needs are being threatened, we act accordingly, right? We, as I said, we might avoid, we might compete, We're less likely to compromise when we're in a stress situation, because we're experiencing fear, we're experiencing anxiety. We're just not able to work at the same capacity in terms of thinking rationally and solve problems. So again, the impact of stress on conflict is that it might heighten um, we might get into conflict more easily because we're stressed out. But then it also challenges our ability to get out of the conflict because we can't problem solve in the same way. So what does that mean for us as practitioners? Means that in terms of creating peace building as a mediator or a conflict coach or a restorative justice practitioner or an executive coach, the many hats that I wear, it means that we really need to be attuned to the emotional health of the people that we are working with, even more so than usual, right? We need to really think about their emotional needs because our emotional needs are so attacked right now because of COVID. It also means that we need to be creative in empowering people to meet their needs. Because the parties that are in conflict are not as able to problem solve, not as empowered, not as creative, and not as rational as they would be under, quote unquote, normal circumstances. It means that us as the peace builders have to do a lot more of that, of thinking sort of for them to create space for them to have a voice and get those needs met in creative ways. It just means there's a lot more brainstorming and thinking and hope that needs to happen for our parties to the conflict, if they're experiencing this chronic stress and fatigue that's making it harder for them to get past the conflict. It also means that we need to be extra aware of equity. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but it's actually an active effort to make sure that people get their needs addressed equitably, right? We know historically that health and financial crisis unduly and disproportionately affects poor people, affects people of color, affects minorities, right? We know that. COVID has really put that inequity under a microscope. And so conflict is not just, peace rather is not just the absence of fighting or the absence of war over needs not being met. But if there is not violence, but there is still structural barriers to certain members of society getting their health and financial needs met, then that is still a society that's not equitable and there's still structural and systemic violence, even if there's not physical violence happening that we're not witnessing. So it means that we as a society need to think about peace differently, not just a theoretical difference, but a practical difference in terms of ways that we create equitable spaces for people, which is really the job of a restorative justice practitioner like myself, is to create spaces so that there is room for equity and equal voice when there are crises like the ones that we're facing. And so I would just also like to end that as a restorative justice practitioner and peace builder, most of my job is to create cultures of peace, to create strong communities. And there's a added need for that, as I said, because there is an increased urgency to create strong relationships in communities that can take care of each other and provide a source of resiliency. Because as I said, COVID has really taken away some of our community, which normally is what helps create resiliency, right? So for example, I did it's called circle process, basically meeting with teams to help them be more resilient. So one of the things we did when COVID first happened, one of the clients that I work with is a school district, and so I met with their social work team for about a month when COVID first hit to help them process. And so it's an opportunity as peace builders to really create cultures and communities and relationships that are strong and that are empowered and resilient, because it's those spaces that can protect people and create value, create added value when we're in moments of pandemic. And so I would just say that as peace builders, our job is to empower communities to be not only work well together, but work well together in ways that build equity, that build value, that give people dignity and worth, and then help them address their needs. All of those things are a great challenge during this time of pandemic. There is an added urgency to the work that we do to not only end violence, but also make sure that the least among us, especially, are getting their needs met. And that is the work of peace.